In this video we're going to talk about arrays, and up to this point if we wanted to manage information about 10 different cars or 10 different customers, we would have to create a variable for each and every one of those cars or customers. This obviously isn't a very practical way to manage large groups of data. There has to be a better way, and that way is with what's called an array. An array is like a variable, except that it holds multiple values instead of just one. We used the analogy back several lessons ago, or whenever we talked about a variable being like a bucket, because you could store information in it. And if that's the case, then an array is a bucket that contains lots of smaller buckets. So you can put in information in each one of the smaller buckets, and when you're done, all you got to do is pick up the one big bucket and move it around, and it's much more manageable that way. And that's the same thought with arrays. So let's take a look at arrays in a practical use by creating a new project. I created a new project called Lesson 15, and I'm going to add a single button onto my form. I'm going to double click that button so I can get into the button 1 click event. And here I'm going to type out a declaration for a regular variable as a starting point. So in this case we've created a variable called cars that we've dimensioned as a string. And if I wanted to make this into an array of strings so that it could hold multiple cars in here, I would need to make just a couple of changes. First of all, I need to put an open and close bracket at the end of the word string. And secondly, since an array is an object in the .NET framework, I'd have to instantiate a new instance of string and add square brackets to it as well. So here we're going to do this equals new string, and I'm going to use an open square bracket, and then I'm going to type in the number of elements that I want in my array. So in this case I'm going to have 4 elements in my array. So that's how we would convert and just take a simple string variable declaration and convert it into a string array, or an array of strings called car. This particular car array, string array, would hold 4 elements. So now I'm going to write some code to populate each of the elements of the array with an AutoMaker. So here we go. Car. Whoops. So here's the tricky thing to remember. Arrays are zero-based, meaning that if you want 4 elements, you'll reference elements 0 through 3 like I've done right here. If you want to ignore a given element, like say for example we want to get rid of that, we certainly could, and it's still a valid array. We just would not have any value in the third element, or where we would use the number 2. There's another way that we can create and initialize an array. So here, let me do this. String more cars equals new string. We'll have 3 elements. Then I'm going to use an open and close curly brace and do something like Buick, GMC, and Volvo. And so all in one step, what this would do is create a new array of strings called more cars, and it would set each of the elements of more cars 0, 1, and 2 equal to Buick, GMC, and Volvo respectively. And we obviously don't want to forget our end of line character. So let me comment this out because I want to make one more point about arrays. If we needed to add an additional element to our array, what would we do? Like say for example we needed to add Mercedes here. And let's just add back in this one to get our example back to its starting point. What if I needed to add a fourth element? What would happen? Well, let's run the application and see what occurs. I get an exception. It says index was outside the bounds of the array. So we try to put a value outside of the boundary of what the array was currently able to hold. In other words, we only had so many buckets, and we tried to imagine that we had an extra bucket, and it just doesn't work. Now, in this simple situation, all we would really need to do is just change this to 5, but there might be times when you're developing an application where you simply can't redimension an array this easily because you don't know ahead of time how many elements that you're going to need. And unfortunately in C#, there's no way to redimension or resize an array on the fly. As the lesson text for Lesson 15 suggests, there are other collection objects in the .NET framework that will allow you to have this kind of behavior where you can dynamically resize an array or in a collection when you need it. But a simple array will not allow you to do that. So back in Lesson 9, when we were talking about program flow and we were talking about iteration statements, we said that iteration statements will make a lot more sense whenever we get to talk about arrays. So here we are, and let's talk about how to iterate through an array to display all the elements of the array in, let's say, a message box, for example. So let me paste in some code that I wrote just a few moments ago. Okay, so you can see I have this for statement here. I'm also going to get rid of this line and change this back to 4 and then save. So now let's talk about what will happen here. We've created a for statement. We've initialized the counter variable as an integer, set it equal to 0. Our condition is as long as the counter is less than the car.length. And what does this mean? That means the number of elements in the array and the default dimension of the array. So in this case, we would expect to see the number 4, and then obviously our iterator at the very end. And each time we loop through our for statement, we will display the current car based on the counter variable, which again gets increased each time we pass through the statement. And we refer to an element by stating car, open bracket, the name of the variable, in this case counter, and then the close bracket. So let's go ahead and run this to see how this works. Okay, our 0th element, first element, second element, and third element. Excellent. So if you're using a large set of data, using arrays or one of the other collections that are available in the .NET framework, the array being the simplest of those collections, using an array gives you the advantage of iterating through each of the elements of that array. Here we're merely displaying it, but you can potentially modify it in your code, save it, delete it. You can do whatever you need to do to that particular piece of information once it's in an array. It's just like a variable. The next thing that I want to show you is a multi-dimensional array. Up to this point we've only looked at a single dimension array, but we can actually have more than one dimension. So let me paste in some code that I wrote a little bit earlier. And this is an example of a multi-dimensional array called trucks. So it's a string trucks equals new string 3, 3. What does this mean? We're basically stating that there are 2 dimensions. This is the first dimension and that's the second dimension. This is the first dimension and that's the second dimension. And the first dimension will have 3 elements and the second dimension will have 3 elements. Now I could have had like 4 and 7 or 500 and 900. We don't have to keep them at 3 and 3. But essentially what this will do is allow us to reference sub-0, 0, sub-0, 1, sub-0, 2, and sub-1, 0, sub-1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 0, 2, 1, 2, 2. So it gives us 9 elements within our multi-dimensional array. And so you can see how I referenced it here. The first column of numbers corresponds to the definition of that particular dimension, and the same would be true for the second definition. It would represent the second dimension here. Could I add another statement like this? Well, if I did want to do that, what would I have to do? I'd have to change this to 4 in order to make that work. So you can see where this might be useful in order to segregate data by some type of qualifier. In this case, the qualifier becomes the make for a specific model, where I might have all of the Toyota trucks grouped together in element 0, all the Nissan trucks together in element 1, and so on. You can also think of this like a two-dimensional grid, an XY axis, and you can map points within that XY axis using a two-dimensional array. We can also create a three-dimensional array, so let me paste in some code for that. As you can see, I created a three-dimensional array called flights. It has 3 dimensions. The first dimension has 3 elements, the second dimension has 4 elements, and the third dimension has 5 elements. So you can see how I've used this here. With flights from Chicago to Dallas, we'll have one flight at 5 a.m., another from Chicago to Dallas at 6 a.m., and so on. So any combination of departure cities and arrival cities and times when that flight would run, I can represent that in a multi-dimensional array like so. So 3 times 4 times 12 would give us a total of 60 flights. And I certainly didn't want to type all those out, but you get the basic idea. Let's go back here and talk about how we can iterate through a multi-dimensional array. As you can see, I pasted in some code underneath our trucks example, and essentially I nest one for statement inside of another for statement. So my outer for statement will allow us to loop through the first dimension, dimension 0, so that would be essentially this column, and the inner for statement would allow us to loop through our second dimension, dimension 1. We can't use the length property of our array like we did before, because the length property assumes that we're only using the first dimension, but we want to get at both dimensions here, so we'll have to use this get upper bound and then type in which dimension that we want to access. So we've created a first counter called I and a second counter called J, and as long as we stay below the upper bound +1, then we'll continue to run this loop, and this loop will continue to run as long as J is less than the upper bound of the second dimension. Inside that for statement, we'll display a message box that will show the current I from the outer for statement and the J element from the inner statement. This might be a little confusing, but let's just run it and see how it works. This is from our first example, and this is from our second. Toyota, Nissan, and then Chevy. So what you can do if you're having trouble understanding exactly how this works is just set a breakpoint and then begin to step through the application and watch the values. We start at I equals 0 and J equals 0, and we'll display the element at 0, 0, which will be the Toyota Tundra. And we stay within the second for statement. We don't jump back out just yet until we've finished all of the items in this boundary, the Toyota Sequoia, and so on. So if you get confused about this, the best thing to do, set a breakpoint and just walk through it. You can learn a lot about your code that way. So let's go over some terminology before we conclude this video. First of all, the number of items inside our definition of the array are called dimensions. In this case, we have a three-dimensional array. In this case, we have a two-dimensional array because there's, again, two dimensions. And this is a single-dimension array. Each combination of the dimensions will produce a single element. In this case, down here, sub 0, 0, 0 contains the value of Chicago, Dallas at 5 a.m. This element of trucks 1, 1 contains only one value, and that is the Nissan Pathfinder. So an index is a specific value inside of a dimension. So we might say that this is the index, the second index of the second dimension. This is the second index of the first dimension. Together, this is a single element of our multi-dimensional array. So just so you understand how the terminology relates. But that concludes the video. As always, I want to encourage you to take a look at the lesson text as well as the extended readings and the definitions, the lesson questions. And in this case, in this lesson, we have an exercise as well to help you fully get your hands around how to use arrays and how to get the most out of them. Thank you.